4 score and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in the great Civil War, testing whether that nation or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they fought here, have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to this great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we were here highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, that was my poor reading of the Gettysburg Address. Let's take a look at this, the Gettysburg Address. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, purchases 17 acres of land and creates a Gettysburg Cemetery to bury the Union soldiers that have died at this battle. Beginning in October 27, now you got to understand that Lincoln gave this speech on November 17th of 1863. So on October 27th, burial crews had been moving bodies all over the place, side by side on farms, on where they were going to lay them out inside this here Gettysburg Cemetery. From October 27th to November 19th, only 1/3 of the soldiers were actually buried. When Lincoln arrived, there were caskets stacked at the station and all over the place. When he spoke at the dedication of the ceremony, he could see the bodies stacked up in caskets, and he could see workers back behind the crowd actually still putting bodies in the ground. And Lincoln decides to use this as a chance to impart a sense of purpose to the Union cause. In his speech, Lincoln attempted to shift the purpose of the war from the Union for the Union to calling it a new birth of freedom and speaking of equality as the fundamental purpose of his war. So I would say Lincoln changed his mind on what the ideals of his war were. Okay. Now, one of the really funny things is Lincoln wasn't even the main speaker at this ceremony. That would have been Edward Everett, probably one of the greatest orators at that time. Edward Everett spoke for 2.5 hours about the Civil War and about the Battle of Gettysburg and the deaths. And then Lincoln spoke for what, 2 minutes, maybe a little bit more. Lincoln's address was only 272 words, so it wasn't that long. How long did it take me? Lincoln wrote this Gettysburg Address not on a train like people are saying. Maybe I even said that I was kidding, but he wrote this in his office and he worked on it really, really hard to try to get his point across. He wrote this one, and then there were approximately five others that were in circulation that he had written, and people were asking him for a copy so they could use it as a way of actually raising funds for the soldiers and for burials and stuff. 15,000 people swamped into Gettysburg just to listen to this speech. They came there because they knew it was going to be such a momentual, a huge thing for the country, especially for the Union. The president was there, Everett was there. So 15,000 people come into Gettysburg. Now remember how small Gettysburg was. Gettysburg had a population of 2,200 people at that time. So people were sleeping three to a bed, four to a bed, 28 to a house. Just, it was really crazy. The only matter of fact, there were only two in the whole Gettysburg that actually had their own beds, and that was Abraham Lincoln and Edward Everett. Okay, so they made do. The cemetery was only for Union war soldiers or the Union dead. So you got to say, I think I mentioned upon it earlier, was that huge 17-mile Confederate Army train of horse-drawn carriages carrying their dead out of there. Um, so when you're thinking of the amount of bodies that were still in caskets and the amount of bodies in that train, it's just remarkable. And the stench must have been horrendous. So the cemetery was purchased by influential people of Gettysburg, where they were raised enough money to actually turn the battlefield into a national cemetery when trying to honor those Union soldiers that had died. Um, those Confederate soldiers who were killed in the battle, most of them were brought home, but some of them remained on the battlefield. I don't believe ever to be buried. If they were just thrown into the ground. No proper burials for those guys. Bodies were being buried right next to the dedication ceremony. And this kind of, like I said earlier, Lincoln used to actually bring that sadness and somberness to the whole war. Probably taking people's minds off of why are we even doing this. So many people were supportive of Lincoln doing this speech, and that was probably all the Republican leaning papers supportive of the president, as did war Democrat papers, newspapers. But others called this uh, a sham. They sympathized with the South and dismissed it as a weak and poorly delivered speech given by Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was able to successfully redefine the war as a fight to uphold the principles upon which the nation was founded. Although the Gettysburg Address, if you really think about it, never really addresses the war, it is empowering and is a timeless appeal. Rather than Lincoln actually, you know, linking his speech, linking, not Lincoln, linking his speech to the details of war, Lincoln instead invokes universal ideas such as devotion, democracy, human equality, and the importance of honoring the sacrifices made by those who died for their country. This makes it a speech that could be given any time. We have people in Iraq and Iran. We have people in Pakistan, people fighting now who you could actually read the Gettysburg Address to them and kind of would still pertain. The Gettysburg Address also argues that the Declaration of Independence is more important than the Constitution. Now, we learned long time ago under John Marshall that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, right? Okay. Lincoln says otherwise. He says he focuses on the ideal set forth when he says, "Fourscore and 7 years ago." What is fourscore and 7 years ago? Hmm. The Declaration of Independence stated all men were created equal. Well, fourscore and 7 years ago, right? That was the American Revolution, fourscore plus seven. Okay. And he says that whereas slaveholders at the time argued they had a constitutional right to own slaves, Lincoln called on America to welcome a new birth of freedom, implying that the U.S. Constitution must change to embrace equal rights for all. What's funny is that Lincoln was only captured in one picture in that whole address, and that was taken by some kid, 18-year-old kid, while Lincoln was mobbing, getting mobbed by everybody. You could hardly see him. But it was the only picture ever taken in at that time. You could see like the top of his head. Lincoln's speech, the Gettysburg Address, reflected the ideals and principles of equality, and he made reference to the past, present, and future of the nation. What was the significance of fourscore and 7 years? I know you've been on the edge of your seat. The Gettysburg Address was delivered in 1863, 87 years before this date, 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence. So fourscore must be 10 years a score? I don't know. Figure that out. Yeah, it's got to be fourscore. Four score is 10, that's 47. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the Gettysburg Address.